In the First Heretic, 5 word-bearer captains pass through the Emperor's gene vault as insubstantial phantoms, ghosts of a future not yet happened, shown by a demon the very moment the Primarchs were born. They move through 20 pods. At 19 of them, they don't pause. At the 11th, Argel Tal stops and looks through the glass. Canon records his observation. The 11th Primarch was still innocent, still pure. His companion Xaphen noted that killing the being inside, right then, would unwrite a shameful future. Not an evil future, a shameful one. Traitor Primarchs get evil futures. This one got shame. A lot of you have suspected this for years, that the 11th Primarch was a blank, a null, engineered as an anti-chaos countermeasure too dangerous to deploy and too valuable to destroy. Today we're not re-arguing if. We're asking what happened to him and why the Emperor didn't just kill him. Because the evidence scattered across the lore doesn't point toward destruction. It points toward something far more deliberate, far more cold, and far more consistent with how the Emperor actually operated. Let's start with the records, because the records are the first piece of evidence. The Lexicanum's entry on the 11th Primarch gives you the official position. He met a tragic fate that caused him to be expunged from imperial records, at least 43 years before the onset of the Horus Heresy. 3 things in that sentence are doing enormous work. Tragic fate, not death. Expunged from imperial records, an administrative action, not a physical one. At least 43 years before. This happened while the Imperium was functioning normally, not during wartime chaos. The formal name for what was applied to the 11th Primarch and his legion is the Edict of Obliteration, also known by its Latin designation, Damnatio Memoriae, condemnation of memory. The edict is defined as the deliberate destruction of records, icons, symbols, and monuments pertaining to an individual. It's a records policy. It destroys information about a person. It does not require the destruction of the person themselves. Every source that describes what happened to the lost Primarchs uses this kind of language: expunged, erased, deleted, obliterated from records. When those same sources confirm a Primarch's physical death, the language is completely different. Horus was killed by the Emperor. Sanguinius was killed by Horus. Ferrus Manus was decapitated by Fulgrim. The Lexicanum carries 0 ambiguity about confirmed physical deaths. It uses explicit verbs with explicit agents. For the 11th Primarch, it uses tragic fate and expunged from imperial records. That is bureaucratic concealment language applied under a falsification policy, not a death record. Some sources do use the word destroyed in the context of the lost Primarchs. One YouTube lore transcript notes that imperial listings of the 20 legions describe them as expunged or destroyed. You should know that word is in the record. But here's the critical context. A record saying someone was destroyed under a deliberate falsification policy isn't independent evidence of destruction. It's evidence of the policy working. The Edict of Obliteration creates false records by design. A falsified record saying destroyed is exactly what that policy produces when it wants you to believe something is gone. The cover story and the evidence are the same document. Now look at the people who actually know the truth and pay close attention to how they talk. Rogel Dorn is the most honest man in Horus Heresy canon. He doesn't soften things he knows. He tells the Emperor directly that the Webway project was a failure. He dismantles his most beloved fortifications without complaint when the Codex demands it. He isn't a man who speaks with sentiment he doesn't mean. In the Lightning Tower, Dorn stands before the empty plinths where the statues of the 2nd and 11th once stood, and calls their absences aberrations. He wonders aloud whether they were warnings that no one had heeded. Not deaths, aberrations. things that happened that shouldn't have, that left a mark, that might have told them something about what was coming. Elsewhere, the language attributed to Dorn is that those brothers were lost to us, not dead, not killed, lost. Rogel Dorn chose that word with the precision he chose everything. Malcador the Sigillite is the second witness. When Horus, Jagatai Khan, and Alfarius stormed the Council of Terra, furious that a lost brother's statue was being removed from the investiary, Horus tried to speak the Primarch's name in open defiance. Malcador, enraged, psychically choked him mid-word. This is from the last council. Horus managed only the beginning of the name before it was cut off. The Sigillite's reaction wasn't the grief of a man defending a memory. It was the violence of someone protecting a live secret. You don't psychically assault your war master over the name of someone simply dead and gone. That reaction, that extreme, that immediate, is what protecting something still present looks like. The Lexicanum's Primarch 11 entry contains a detail that's easy to skip. His legionaries were left behind, leaderless and forsaken, but they didn't share the fate of their Primarch. Guilliman and Dorn argued in their favor so that they were spared, and Malcador ensured that they were attuned to the new circumstances. The soldiers were spared. The Primarch's fate was separate and deliberately dissociated from theirs. Canon doesn't give the two outcomes the same language because they weren't the same outcome. In the First Heretic, Argel Tal observes during the Gene Vault vision that the Ultramarines' numbers mysteriously swelled each time one of the two lost legions was erased. The surviving Marines were absorbed, distributed, folded into existing structures, made to disappear into the ranks of other legions. Malcador managed the transition. The Primarch, however, had a different arrangement. Not absorbed, dealt with separately, by the Sigillite himself. And 10,000 years later, Robute Guilliman still refuses to use the 11th Primarch's gene seed for Primaris Space Marines. In Dark Imperium, when discussing viable genetic stock with Call, Guilliman explicitly excludes the lost Primarchs. His reasoning: the Marines weren't at fault, the Primarchs were. He separates the guilt of the Primarchs from the innocence of their soldiers. If both were simply dead, that distinction would be ceremonial. Guilliman speaks of them as a category of active contamination to be avoided, not a legacy to be mourned. Fabius Bile managed to clone all 20 Primarchs from gathered genetic samples, including the 11th, during the events of Fabius Bile Clone Lord. All the clones were killed by Abaddon's forces during the Battle of Harmony. But the existence of the clone confirms something important. Gene stock for the 11th Primarch survived 10,000 years in accessible form. Bile could construct a working copy. That genetic material came from somewhere that was never destroyed. Now the strategic question, because this is the spine of everything. Why would the Emperor preserve a being like this rather than destroying him? The Emperor's documented approach to chaos wasn't frontal opposition. His grand plan was the Webway project, building a human-controlled transit network that bypassed the warp entirely. The strategy would have starved the Chaos Gods by denying them the psychic traffic of millions of souls entering their realm. He didn't plan to fight chaos and win. He planned to make chaos irrelevant by routing around it. This is the man who designed that strategy. He doesn't look at an anti-chaos asset and ask, "Should I destroy this?" He asks how to preserve every option until he needs it. His behavior at Molech tells the same story. The Emperor traveled to a warp gate on a night world and struck a bargain with the Chaos Gods themselves. The lore holds that he forged an unknown bargain with the Chaos Gods and was imbued with the knowledge required to ultimately create the Primarchs. He didn't defeat the Chaos Gods at Molech. He negotiated with them, extracted what he needed, and intended to deny them the payoff later by building the Webway. This is a man who treats existential threats as resources to be managed and options to be maintained, not obstacles to be smashed. The Dragon of Mars is the clearest structural precedent. The Lexicanum describes it as an ancient, exceedingly powerful entity currently imprisoned in the Noctis Labyrinth on Mars. Imprisoned, not destroyed. An entity of catastrophic, destructive potential that the Emperor chose to contain, not obliterate. A weapon too dangerous to use freely, too valuable to discard permanently, locked away under guard for reasons that remain obscured from official history. The architecture of that decision maps directly onto what we're arguing about the 11th Primarch. An entity too dangerous to deploy, too valuable to destroy, placed in long-term containment, waiting. The Lexicanum's account of why the 11th Primarch was erased adds a specific detail. His loss threatened the core ideals of the Great Crusade and might have ruined the burgeoning Imperium of Man. This isn't the description of a Primarch who betrayed the Emperor to chaos. The same source is explicit that his failure was highly unlikely to involve chaos. The Lexicanum notes that Lorgar didn't even discover chaos existed until after both lost Primarchs were already erased. Whatever the 11th Primarch did, he did it without chaos involvement. His legion's loyalty was manipulated by the 11th Primarch toward ill ends, directed by him toward ends that caused the Space Wolves to be deployed against him. Think about what the Space Wolves represent as a deployment choice. They were sent against Magnus for using forbidden psychic powers. They were sent against the 11th Primarch for something else entirely. Whatever it was, the Emperor's response was the same instrument, the Legion designed as an enforcement tool against other legions. A Null Primarch commanding loyal Space Marines against an Emperor who can't use his psychic powers within a Null field radius. That's a threat the Emperor couldn't fight with his usual tools. And a threat the Emperor couldn't defeat directly is exactly the kind of threat he would choose to contain rather than confront. The chamber detail from the chamber at the end of memory puts a physical location on this. During siege preparations, Rogel Dorn accidentally uncovers the personal chambers of the 2nd and 11th Primarchs inside the Imperial Palace. Sealed, unmapped, moved to an unexpected location. He finds the door bearing the old-style mark of 11, a steel portico. He has a heated discussion with Malcador and momentary recollection of the lost Primarch's misfortune, then decides to bury the place. He calls it just a tomb that should be forgotten. Rogel Dorn, the most literal man in the setting, calls an empty room a tomb. Not old quarters, not abandoned chambers, a tomb. The word implies something, or someone, interred inside. He chooses to bury it, not demolish it, not cleanse it, bury it under new construction, seal it from access, allow the palace's layers to grow over it. That is precisely what you do with something that needs to remain inaccessible without being destroyed. And then the canonical vision that the Lost Primarchs fandom wiki references in a chaos-induced sequence. Subject 11 in the dark cells beneath the Imperial Palace. Not a memorial, not a designation on a door. Subject 11, present, beneath Terra, in a facility whose name suggests ongoing custody. The Edict of Obliteration removed the name. The dark cells kept the subject. Before going further, the strongest counter-argument deserves a real answer. Not a summary, not a dismissal, the full thing. The objection, precisely stated. Due to their nature, a Primarch can't be a blank. Most of a Primarch's strength comes from a very powerful warp essence. Being a blank would cancel that out and make them weaker at best. A blank with no soul would be fundamentally incompatible with what a Primarch actually is. That's not a straw man. That's the Steel Man version, and it's genuinely strong. Here's why. Primarchs aren't physically engineered and separately connected to the warp. They're warp present by construction. The Lexicanum is explicit. The Primarch project required forbidden sciences and arcane lore derived from the warp. The Emperor combined his own genetic material with that of Erda, a perpetual, and then used techniques acquired through his bargain at Molech to spiritually engineer beings whose souls would be extraordinary. Primarch's souls shine in the immaterium with such intensity that the Chaos Gods detected the project across the galaxy and acted to scatter the pods before the Primarchs matured. The Emperor inscribed arcane protective runes on every gestation capsule. He built what the fandom wiki calls the most powerful Geller field ever made around the gene vault itself. All of that infrastructure existed to protect beings of overwhelming warp presence from the attention that presence attracted. A blank operates on the opposite principle. The pariah gene manifests in roughly one individual among a billion. When it appears, it doesn't create a warp absence. It creates an active, negative warp presence that attacks and suppresses warp signatures around it. Psychers near a blank experience progressive loss of psychic function through proximity alone. Non-psychers feel inexplicable dread and revulsion. Warp entities can't perceive blanks through the immaterium. They register as holes in reality where consciousness should exist, but warp feedback returns nothing. The objection is logically sound. Beings defined by overwhelming warp presence and beings defined by the active negation of warp presence appear to be mutually exclusive categories. Creating something that is simultaneously both would seem to violate the fundamental mechanics of how each works. Now here's the counter, and it matters precisely because of how carefully you have to frame it. No canonical source explicitly states that it is impossible for a Primarch to be a blank. The incompatibility is a reasonable inference from the creation mechanics. It isn't a textual rule. The difference between "this seems impossible" and "Canon says this can't happen" is the gap the theory lives in. And the Emperor demonstrably worked with engineering problems at this scale. He created the Sisters of Silence, an entire militant order of blanks organized as an institutionalized anti-warp military force. The Lexicanum describes them as blanks who develop their null abilities to the point of making any use of psychic powers in their presence hazardous to the user. The Anathema Psychana doesn't observe naturally occurring blanks. It cultivates them, trains them, deploys them at scale. In M42, the Sisters of Silence operated their null field fleets in conjunction with the Navis Nobilitae to penetrate the fierce warp storms generated by the Great Rift. Their null ability was sufficiently reliable to be used as navigational infrastructure during the worst warp conditions the Imperium had seen in 10,000 years. The Calexis Temple goes further. It doesn't just recruit blanks, it vat grows them. The process is arduous and complex and produces only a few viable candidates a year, but the process exists. Artificial creation of blank-aligned entities from the pariah gene as an engineering substrate is documented Imperial capability. A Calexis assassin deploys what the lore describes as an 18-inch null field in which enemy psychers suffer significant penalties to their abilities, and carries the Animus Speculum, a device that allows the null field to be modulated, intensified, directed, and used offensively against specific warp-based targets. The null field isn't just emitted passively, it can be aimed. The Emperor who built the Sisters of Silence and the Calexis Temple understood both ends of the warp presence spectrum as engineering problems to be solved, not as fixed natural phenomena to be observed. He treated the pariah gene as a substrate to be cultivated and weaponized at institutional scale. Here's the hinge. The Primarch creation process takes warp energies gained at Molech and binds them into a transhuman body at the genetic and metaphysical level simultaneously. That's positive warp engineering, inserting warp energy signatures into biological architecture to create superhuman beings of extraordinary warp presence. What does it mean to run that same process in reverse? To take the pariah gene, which generates an active negative warp signature, and apply the same engineering discipline, the same genetic amplification, the same binding process to a transhuman body built to the same specification. Not to create a Primarch with a missing warp soul, to create a Primarch whose warp signature is itself a weapon pointed at the warp. A being whose presence doesn't merely deflect warp energy, it annihilates it. No canonical source says this is impossible. The Emperor demonstrably possessed all the component techniques and the setting's own physics, a warp that responds to consciousness, where the greatest psyker's existence implies the engineering possibility of the greatest null, doesn't prohibit it. The important reframe. A blank Primarch wouldn't be a weaker Primarch. It would be a Primarch whose power functions in the opposite direction. The same physical architecture, the same enhanced cognition and strategic capacity, the same capacity for command. But instead of lighting up the immaterium like a signal fire, it would burn through the warp like a wound. The null field at Primarch scale would be something no warp entity, no demon, no chaos power could approach. A silence at the center of the storm. Too valuable to destroy. Too dangerous to deploy without catastrophic consequence. And, this is critical, too threatening to the Emperor's own psychic authority to allow free operation. A being that can suppress the Emperor's powers just by existing in proximity would need to be contained, not trusted, not deployed casually. It would need to be kept where it couldn't become a weapon in someone else's hands, which is exactly what the dark cells are for. Some discussions argue the blank theory applies to the second Primarch rather than the 11th. It deserves acknowledgement before being set aside. The second Primarch was among the first 8 found. The Lexicanum confirms he was discovered around 821 M30, placing him in the earliest wave of reunifications. Fulgrim knew him well enough to describe him as humorless and quiet. That implies years of regular interaction, a developed social personality, a presence his brothers knew. Community consensus connects the Second Legion to the Rangdan Xenocides, a campaign so devastating it consumes some of the Crusade's most effective warriors. The second Primarch's story looks like a military catastrophe from which no one returns, a battlefield loss. The 11th is different in every particular. Discovered in 927 M30, the 19th of 20 Primarchs found, one of the last, he had almost no time to establish the kind of relationships his brothers accumulated over decades. The First Heretic catches him, still innocent, still pure, in a vision from before his rediscovery. He had barely been active before the erasure. The Lexicanum is explicit that his failure was highly unlikely to involve chaos, that his legion's loyalty was manipulated by the 11th Primarch toward ill ends, directed by him, not corrupted from outside. And Rogel Dorn, in The Lightning Tower, explicitly states that the tragedies of the 2nd and the 11th were separate events, different causes, different fates. The 2nd looks like a war loss. The 11th looks like a deliberate containment of something that couldn't be left in the field. The fandom Carcharodons wiki gives you the most important single sentence in their entire lore entry. Nobody knows what Primarch's gene seed led to the creation of the Carcharodons. Opportunities to study the organs involved have been limited. That's a Tier 1 canonical statement. Forge World's original rules listed their progenitor as unknown. For almost every other Space Marine chapter, genetic lineage is confirmed or strongly indicated. The Carcharodons actively resist investigation. The War of the False Primarch is documented as a conflict in which they were a chapter of whom little was known prior to the war, and of which little was learned during it. Deliberate institutional obscuration. The chapter appears from the void, does what it came to do, and vanishes before anyone can run thorough analysis. Multiple genetic analyses have confirmed Raven Guard markers in Carcharodon's gene seed. That's real, and being honest about it matters. The connection to the 19th Legion is there, but the gene seed is consistently described as chimeric. Raven Guard markers appear alongside unexplained genetic components from sources that haven't been identified. The unknown progenitor designation means the dominant gene seed source is unconfirmed, not that the gene seed has been fully characterized. Something is in there that doesn't belong to the Raven Guard. The scenario that reconciles those two facts? When the 11th Legion was disbanded, its surviving Marines needed somewhere to go. Malcador ensured that they were attuned to the new circumstances. In the First Heretic, Argel Tal observes that the Ultramarines' numbers mysteriously swelled each time one of the two lost legions was erased. Some troops were absorbed into Guilliman's legion, but a specific cohort, selected perhaps for inheritable traits running through their lineage, for resistance to warp corruption, for the Null-adjacent qualities that made them the 11th's most effective soldiers, might have been absorbed differently into the Raven Guard's organizational structure, given a covered gene seed blended from legitimate Raven Guard stock to explain the markers.
Sent into the outer dark under a mission only their Primarch could have authorized.
The chimeric gene seed is the fingerprint of that merger. The Raven Guard component is the cover. The unexplained component is the inheritance. But what seals this section isn't the gene seed analysis. It's a phrase in the chapter's own founding myth. They were dispatched into the outer darkness upon that first day of exile, there to ravage the foes of mankind until their final atonement. Their Forgotten One gave them remit unbound, to set about the traitor, the alien, and the renegade without mercy. Their Forgotten One. In 10,000 years of Warhammer 40k lore, Space Marine chapters refer to their progenitor Primarchs by name and title. Blood Angels invoke Sanguinius, Space Wolves invoke Leman Russ, Ultramarines invoke Guilliman, the Carcharodons invoke their Forgotten One, a figure whose name can't be spoken, whose existence was wiped from every record under the Edict of Obliteration, who nevertheless issued orders that an entire chapter still executes in the 41st millennium, with official Imperial sanction. The Badab War establishes the sanction directly. The Carcharodons returned from the Outer Void in 903 M41 to punish those they considered traitors to the Imperium. After the war concluded, the Imperium gave them permission to recruit new Marines from the feral and feudal worlds of the Maelstrom Zone before they embarked again on their solitary crusade. The Imperium recognized their mission, facilitated their operational continuation, and sent them back out. That official recognition sustained across 10,000 years means the authorization behind the mission was legitimate at the level of someone who could bind the Imperium to that obligation. Only a Primarch carries that weight, and only a Primarch whose existence had been expunged from every record would be described as their Forgotten One by the chapter he authorized, in lore written to carefully avoid naming him. Tiberos the Red Wake is the chapter master of the Carcharodons. He holds two formal titles, Shade Lord and Reaper Lord of the Void. He commands the battle barge Nicor. He fights with two power fists named Hunger and Slake, described as combining wicked power talons with twin-linked underbite chain blades. His armor carries a 4+ invulnerable save, indicating equipment of pre-heresy antiquity. His tabletop ability is named Savagery Beyond Reason, and confers a strength bonus to nearby Carcharodons units through proximity alone. A chapter master fighting in armor old enough to predate the Horus Heresy. Weapons named for consumption and void. A chapter that emerged from 10,000 years of exile, participated in a major war, and vanished again. No canonical source attributes null properties to Tiberos directly. That would be overreach. What's confirmed is the totality of the picture: pre-heresy equipment, unknown progenitor gene seed, a founding mission from a Forgotten One whose records were erased under the same policy that erased the 11th Primarch's name, and continued Imperial authorization for a mission no living authority remembers authorizing. The Carcharodons are silent, patient, operating at the extreme edge of known space, waiting for an order from someone who may no longer be able to give it. The Imperial Palace's sublevels dig hundreds of kilometers into Terra's holy bedrock. Beneath the Himalaysian mountains, beneath the gene vaults where the Primarchs were created, there are levels that appear in no official Imperial history. The Lost Primarchs fandom wiki contains a reference from a chaos-induced vision sequence. Subject 11 in the dark cells beneath the Imperial Palace. The specific novel in which this vision appears isn't identified in the available source material. This is a single source reference and worth flagging as such. But a single canonical reference is still canonical. It exists in the wiki, sourced to a vision sequence in an official publication. Subject 11, designated, present, in the dark cells, beneath Terra. The word subject paired with a Roman numeral is bureaucratic classification language for an active custodial record, not a memorial designation, not a historical marker. The kind of label applied to something that still requires ongoing classification because it still exists in the system. The Dragon of Mars is currently imprisoned in the Noctis Labyrinth on Mars. The Lexicanum uses currently, active, present tense. The Emperor's documented practice with entities of catastrophic power is containment, not destruction. The Edict of Obliteration removed the name from every record. The bureaucratic designation system kept the subject number. Subject numbers don't require maintenance for something that doesn't exist. The Terminus Decree is an ancient scripture written on millennia-old parchment, sealed within the Grey Knight's Chamber of Purity on Titan. The 10th edition Grey Knight's Codex describes it as infinitely dangerous and will either save mankind from certain defeat or doom it. Its existence goes unrecorded in all the official imperial histories. A contingency plan so extreme it required the most secretive Space Marine chapter in existence as its custodians, hidden from every official record, preserved across 10,000 years in a secure facility on a moon the Chaos Gods couldn't find because it was moved into the warp during the Siege of Terra. Here's where honesty matters, because the community framing of the Terminus Decree needs a correction before this argument can properly close. The revealed content of the Terminus Decree, as disclosed in the 10th edition Codex, isn't a direct activation order for a hidden Primarch. The actual canon points toward instructions about what happens to the Emperor himself. Specifically, protocols ensuring that the being on the Golden Throne, or a fragment of his consciousness, can't override the Imperium's survival calculus. The most consistent reading across those who've analyzed the reveal is that the decree is an Emperor-sanctioned, Malcador-planned protocol designed to prevent even the Emperor's will from becoming an obstacle to the Imperium's continuation. Some community analysis frames this as an instruction set for making sure the Emperor doesn't get off the throne under any circumstances. Not through resurrection, not through the intervention of a shard of his psyche, not through any mechanism that might deploy his full power against the Imperium's interests rather than for them. That isn't the same as a Null Primarch's deployment order, but the logic is identical. The Terminus Decree says, there is a scenario in which the Emperor himself, the supreme command authority, the source of the Astronomicon, the being whose psychic presence sustains the Imperium's functional infrastructure, becomes a liability rather than an asset. In that scenario, a protocol authorized before his effective death and hidden from all official record becomes the operating instruction. The document is described as either saving mankind or dooming it, depending on when it's used. That's the language of a weapon of last resort. Now map that logic onto Subject 11. The Emperor sustains the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that makes warp navigation possible across the Imperium. 1,000 psychers die every day to maintain his strength. Without the Astronomicon, warp navigation collapses. The Imperium's fleets go dark within years. Supply lines fail. Reinforcement becomes impossible. The entire military and administrative apparatus of the Imperium stops functioning. The Emperor's continued existence on the Golden Throne is the single point of failure for everything. A Null Primarch brought within proximity of the Emperor's location on Terra would suppress the Emperor's warp presence. The Astronomicon would dim. Navigation would fail. The Imperium would begin dying from strategic starvation. That's the cost of deployment. That's why Subject 11 waits in the dark cells rather than standing in the field. But there exists a scenario in which that cost becomes worth paying. A scenario in which chaos has grown so pervasive, so structurally embedded in the warp's relationship to Terra, that the Emperor's psychic output is no longer holding it at bay, it's feeding it. In which the dying beacon has become a chaos attractor. In which the psychic death scream of a decaying god entombed in gold is pulling the warp toward Terra rather than pushing it away. In that scenario, a living anti-warp weapon who silences the psychic environment around him, who can operate in conditions where no other asset can function, who suppresses the very thing that chaos hunts, who might close a wound that the Emperor's continued existence is keeping open, becomes the only viable option left. The audience framing that keeps circulating in these discussions captures the dark logic correctly. Deploying the 11th Primarch in a true terminus scenario, even one where the null field's cost includes extinguishing the Astronomicon, makes more sense than any alternative the Imperium currently has. Not as a weapon of conquest or expansion, as a weapon of final silence. A controlled collapse of the psychic infrastructure that chaos is currently exploiting, executed before a catastrophic, uncontrolled collapse occurs anyway. You don't activate that weapon until you've exhausted every other option. You don't even want to know it's there until you have no choice. You absolutely don't destroy it, because once chaos reaches the scale where you'd need it, nothing else works. A fire extinguisher behind glass labeled "break only in emergency" isn't a liability, it's the last line. And the Emperor, the man who preserved the Dragon of Mars, who bargained with the Chaos Gods rather than fighting them, who built the webway to circumvent rather than confront, wasn't a man who destroyed his last lines. Take the full picture together. The Lexicanum says the 11th Primarch met a tragic fate and was expunged from imperial records, not killed, not destroyed, administratively concealed under a policy designed to make things appear as though they never existed. The erasure happened at least 43 years before the Horus Heresy, under normal imperial functioning. Rogel Dorn used "lost to us," not "dead." Malcador psychically silenced Horus rather than let a name be spoken, with the violence of someone protecting something live. Guilliman refused the 11th Primarch's gene seed 10,000 years later and called the Primarch, not the Marines, the source of fault. Fabius Bile cloned the 11th Primarch from existing gene stock, confirming the genetic material survived. Dorn called the 11th Primarch's sealed chambers a tomb that should be forgotten, and chose to bury rather than demolish them. In the First Heretic, the 11th Primarch is described as still innocent, still pure. Developmental preservation language from a vision that catches him intact in his pod. A chaos-induced vision references Subject 11 and the dark cells beneath the Imperial Palace. The Emperor's documented pattern with entities of catastrophic power is containment over destruction. Dragon of Mars imprisoned in the Noctis Labyrinth on Mars. Chaos gods negotiated with at Molech rather than fought. The webway built to circumvent rather than confront. The Carcharodons serve a forgotten one who issued them remit unbound, a figure whose name was expunged under the Edict of Obliteration, who carried the authority of a Primarch, and whose mission the Imperium still formally recognizes 10,000 years later. Tiberos the Red commands them in pre-heresy armor from a chapter with deliberately unknown gene seed and institutional secrecy consistent with a chapter designed never to be found. The Terminus decree sits on Titan behind multiple seals, described as infinitely dangerous, hidden from official history, its revealed logic touching on the Emperor himself, and the scenarios in which even his existence becomes the problem rather than the solution. None of the activation mechanisms have triggered. Two explanations remain. Either the threat hasn't been bad enough yet, and with the Great Rift tearing the galaxy open, the Golden Throne visibly failing, the Astronomicon flickering, the 13th Black Crusade having broken through Cadia, that explanation grows harder to sustain. Or the Emperor is already too far gone to give the order.
And whoever would need to authorize the release of Subject 11 from the dark cells doesn't know he's there, doesn't have the standing to act on it, or isn't alive anymore to use either. Somewhere beneath Terra, in levels that appear in no official record, under a designation number in a bureaucratic system nobody admits exists, the 11th Primarch waits. He waited through the Horus Heresy, through the Age of Apostasy, through the 13th Black Crusade, through the opening of the Great Rift. The records said destroyed because the records were designed to lie. That's what the Edict of Obliteration is for. The question was never whether he's there. The question is whether anyone with the authority to open the dark cells will still be standing when the moment finally arrives. Subscribe for more of this. There's more canon to map.